So this week we are looking at chapters 8 and 9, and we're going to look at how power expanded over this time, how democracy expanded to some, and then also how the nation started to expand. So I want you to think about between the time period of 1790 and the 1830s, about 40 to 50 years. During that time period, how did the United States expand federal power, reshape its economy, and redefine who counted in American democracy? So let's first look at extending federal power. So in the early republic, Americans, we often debated how strong the federal government should be. And this is Alexander Hamilton. Under leaders like him and George Washington and John Madison, the government began to assert authority through a national bank, the assumption of state debts, federal taxation, and the expansion of executive authority. And the War of 1812 reinforced nationalism and convinced many Americans that a stronger federal government was necessary to survive. And what you're going to notice, if you know anything about Alexander Hamilton and his beef with TJ, Thomas Jefferson, one had believed in implied powers of the Constitution, and the other one believed in actual powers of the Constitution. And for bonus points, if you can email me or message me through Canvas and tell me which one sided with implied powers and which one sided with actual powers, I'll give you bonus points on the next exam. But that's really important because it's how do we interpret the Constitution? If it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, are we allowed to do it? And so that's going to be a major debate as we are moving forward between the founding of our nation in 1783 and even through today when we have questions about our Constitution and the constitutionality of things. But during this time period between 1790 and the 1830s, this period is sometimes called the era of good feelings. But beneath the surface, serious regional and political tensions are growing. So federal power expanded. It didn't do it all at once, but through crisis, through war, and also out of basic economic need. Also during the early 19th century, we saw dramatic economic transformation. And so there's this little thing called the market revolution that starts to happen. And the market revolution included transportation improvements. So we see the construction of things like canals and roads. The biggest one that came during this time is known as the Erie Canal. We also have the growth of banking. We no longer do we have a Bank of the United States. There is a bank called the Bank of America, but that has nothing to do with our federal government. That's something separate. We no longer have a United States bank, but we did during this time period. We also see the expansion of manufacturing, and we see a cotton boom in the South. And this shift connected local economies into a national and even into a global market because we have all these things connecting us. What you're also going to see, and I can't remember if it's in chapter 8 or chapter 9, but there's a map of railroads. And you can see how even domestically we become more connected through railroads, through roads, through those canals. But although this is really good things, this transformation is really uneven. And you're going to read about how the North will quickly start to industrialize, but the South is left behind. And instead of investing money on factories or on economic growth, Southerners invest their money in more land and in more slaves to work that land. And then as we do come out here westward, we do see a focus on land and agriculture. So again, that economic growth, it does increase opportunity, but also for some. There's a lot of inequality and regional division that's going to develop out of that economic opportunity and growth. I also have included here a map, and this map is, I believe this is in chapter 8, but this shows you Indian cessions, so like them giving up land, their ancestral land, and I want you to see how much land they end up giving up as we begin to push our borders further and further west. So you can look at this and Achieve in your textbook, in the ebook, but you can tell as Anglos, as whites start to really move and push westward, they are also pushing out a lot of these Native Americans. And one president you're going to read about is Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, he starts Indian removal from these areas, and it's his predecessor that is going to finish Indian removal. And you're going to read more about that in, I believe it's chapter 9. So as Americans, as we pushed westward, new states are going to enter the Union. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing for the U.S. It's a bad thing for the people that we're displacing, like the natives. But what happens as this expansion starts to intensify, we have a lot of debates over slavery. This new state that is coming into the Union, is it going to be a slave state or a free state? Because right now, during the 1800s, what we're trying to do is keep an even balance. We want an even number of slave states and an even number of free states because of congressional representation, right? We don't want one to have the upper hand when it comes in voting because they're either going to be pro-slavery or pro-abolition. There's also competition for land, right? We're competing with each other, and we're competing with other nations that are part of our westward expansion. We still have the British on the frontier. You have Mexico. You've got Spain at the beginning of the 1800s that's controlling, but then Mexican independence comes in the 1820s. So then we have the country of Mexico to deal with as we are moving westward and trying to gain more land. So there's that competition for land that's going to lead to wars and conflict. Then you also have conflict with native nations, right? We have native peoples that we are continually displacing over and over and over again. What we do start to see, though, are different regional economies developing. In the north, it's very industrialized. In the south, it's more plantation, and I want you to keep in mind, not every Southerner owned a plantation. Only about 5% of the white population in the South were actually wealthy enough to own a plantation, but think about how many slaves we have in the South. For that small percentage of white owners to own that many people, that tells you a lot about what was important in the South. Cotton and slaves. The American economy was built on the back of slaves. So what you're going to notice is that Southern economy is very fearful and late to industrialize until really the middle of the Civil War, when that's the big issue that we're fighting over. And you're also going to see in the West, it's agricultural based, right? So growing a lot of our food, not only in the East, like in Pennsylvania and other areas like that. What you're going to notice in the South, we think of the South as like, oh, that's where agriculture is. No, the South was more interested in growing cotton. They weren't interested in growing necessarily a lot of food that would sustain people nutritionally. So like wheat, that's going to be West, right? So that's why the agricultural West is different than like the plantation South. And then the expansion and limits of American democracy. Let me scoot this down for you. So between 1820 and 1840, voting rights expanded dramatically, but only for white men. So used to, you would have to be a member of a certain church and you had to own property in order to be able to vote. They got rid of the being a member of a church fairly early on, like when we were still colonies in most of those colonies. So most of the states didn't have that requirement anymore. You did have property requirements though, and those are going to be eliminated in most states during this 20-year time span. And what that allows is for middle class and sometimes your upper poor class to come in and be part of political participation. Also, campaigning became more public and populist. So more people are being involved. You actually hear more about like the campaign trails and people going out and trying to do these speeches to these large crowds in order to get them to vote for them. You didn't have that before. Keeping that in mind though, women could not vote. Enslaved people had no rights. I know it says political here, but they had no rights whatsoever. Native Americans were on the verge of facing removal from their lands. It's going to happen in the 1830s when the big removal happens that we all have probably learned about, the Trail of Tears. And then free Black men were increasingly disenfranchised. Disenfranchised means their ability to vote was taken away from them. So they have been able to vote before, but now because of their skin color, they are no longer allowed to vote. So democracy, yes, it expanded, but not to everybody and not equally. It expanded to only white men. Then you have Jackson, and we're going to look more closely at Andrew Jackson. He symbolized this new democratic era. And what he does is he is really good at presenting himself as like the common man. And I'm an outsider. I came from humble backgrounds, which is very true. He was orphaned at a young age. He's captured by the British during the Revolution. He becomes this national hero during the War of 1812. There are songs written about him. And he's this opponent of elite institutions. He really doesn't like, like the status that comes with being rich. Although he has, if you've ever been to Tennessee, he has like his plantation there, which is like acres and acres of land. But anyways, key policies, what he does is he vetoes the second bank of the United States. That is why we no longer have a national bank. It's ironic that he is on the $20 bill. A lot of indigenous peoples that I know, back where I'm from, there's a lot of Choctaw and Cherokee, and they refuse to carry a $20 bill because it has Jackson's face on it. You have to remember, those were the people that he started the Trail of Tears with, and they, grudges are long. There's a long memory. And so that's why they don't carry the $20 bill, because of Jackson. And then also the expansion of presidential authority. And you're going to read more about that in the chapter 9, towards the end of chapter 9. So what Jackson does is he strengthens that executive power, the presidential power, while claiming to defend democracy. And this really creates an important historical tension. And I want you to think about this tension. Can democracy expand while power becomes more centralized? So can democracy expand while power is held in fewer hands? So what you're going to see in these two chapters in this short time span is federal power growing, how the economy transforms. Our economy, whether you like it or not, but the basis of our economy is because of Alexander Hamilton and what he does as a member of Washington's cabinet. You're going to see how democracy expanded for white men, but not for anyone else. Then you're also going to see sectional differences. And when we talk about sectional differences, we are talking about sections of the United States. Primarily the northern section and the southern section. And a lot of times that is known as free versus slave sections. But I want you to realize there are more sections of the United States than just north versus south. There's also east versus west. There's also industrial versus agriculture. That is not north v south, that is north versus the west. So think of it as kind of, these sections, yes, primarily we are talking about north and south because our main tension is going to be between free states and slave states. You're going to learn about this map in the Missouri Compromise and how tensions from this is one of the root causes of the Civil War. The main cause, the only cause, is slavery. Everything else that came from the Civil War, you can talk about states' rights if you want, but that state right that they are arguing about is whether we can or cannot own other people, whether we can or cannot nullify, whether we can or we cannot secede. So all of these issues that come from the Civil War, they all stem from one problem, and that is slavery. So as you're looking at this map and you're learning more about the Missouri Compromise, this is such a hot topic because as in the Mexican-American War of 1848, we gain all this territory. What do we do with it? Mexico didn't allow slavery. Are we going to allow slavery in once free territory? And that's a question that you're going to see come up over and over as you read the remaining of what's left in this book, really from chapters 9 through 12. That's what we're going to read about.